Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
I still remember walking into my sister's engagement party and feeling that familiar weight of being invisible in my own family, the kind of feeling that sneaks in even when everyone is smiling and toasting. Mom, standing there with a perfect smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, leaned over and said, "Your sister's engagement party was beautiful. When will you finally have yours?" I felt the words hit my chest like a reminder of every time I had been overlooked, every moment my accomplishments were minimized, every birthday, holiday, or casual dinner where my efforts were quietly ignored while my sister was celebrated. I smiled, because at that moment, I realized they had no idea what I had been working on, no idea that I had been quietly building a life and a happiness they would never see coming. Everyone else was busy laughing, clinking glasses, talking about flowers, dresses, and who was invited, and I found myself standing at the edge, half smiling, pretending to be proud while inwardly plotting how I could show them the truth without them having the chance to deny it. I remembered the last time Mom had asked me the same question at a family brunch, and how my sister had smirked and whispered, "You know she's never going to beat me at anything," and I had nodded, because arguing never got me anywhere. This time, I knew I didn't have to argue. This time, I had a plan, a quiet little triumph that they would never see coming until it was already done. I spent the evening moving through the crowd, greeting distant relatives and pretending to admire the decorations and the food, while mentally checking the boxes of everything I had accomplished in the last month. Everything that Mom and Dad had dismissed as inconsequential or irrelevant, everything that would make them question their own assumptions about me. I remembered how my sister had looked at me earlier, her expression a mix of pity and smugness, assuming that because I wasn't engaged, I hadn't done anything meaningful. She had no idea I had already set the stage for my own engagement without any of them knowing, without any need for approval or celebration from a family that had a habit of dismissing me. I thought about Dad, standing near the kitchen, laughing at some story my sister was telling about the engagement ring she had received, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that when the truth came out, his laughter would falter. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to reveal what I had been building behind the scenes, the life I had quietly crafted that didn't depend on their approval or their presence. I remembered every comment, every sigh, every dismissive glance that had accumulated over the years, and I realized how much power there was in simply living my life and letting them realize too late that I had already succeeded. As the night went on, I could feel the anticipation building in me, the kind of anticipation that comes from knowing you are about to shift the balance in a room where everyone thinks they are in control. I kept laughing politely at jokes that didn't interest me, nodded along with conversations that didn't involve me, and all the while rehearsed in my mind how I would finally answer the question that Mom had asked without really expecting an answer from me. When she leaned over again later, smiling and sipping her drink, she asked it more softly this time, "So when are you going to have your engagement party?" And I felt a calm confidence settle in me, because this time, I had the perfect answer. And it wasn't going to be just a statement, it was going to be a revelation that they couldn't ignore, that they couldn't erase or redirect, a statement that would finally make them see me as I had always been, quietly capable, quietly successful, quietly in control. I remembered thinking how ironic it was that all their attention, all their celebration, all their whispers about who deserved what were going to be irrelevant in a moment, because I had already moved past their judgment, past their favoritism, past every subtle insult and comparison. The plan had taken months of patience, careful coordination, and keeping my life quiet while they assumed I was falling behind, and now, standing there in a room full of people who had always seen me as the lesser sibling, I felt an almost physical thrill knowing that I would turn that assumption into disbelief and maybe even guilt, though guilt was not the goal, clarity was. By the end of the night, Mom's comment came again, louder, more pointed, and I finally said it, my voice steady, carrying a calm certainty that made her pause. "I did last month. You just weren't invited." I watched her glass slip from her hand and hit the floor, the sudden sound breaking the conversation around us, drawing every eye to the moment, and I knew right then that the first part of the plan had worked perfectly. Everyone looked at me, and in that instant, I realized the real party had just begun, and it was one they weren't ready for, one where I was finally the person they had underestimated, the person who had quietly won. The night continued around me, but my focus was already on the next step. The quiet triumph I had orchestrated that night was just the beginning, and I knew that nothing would ever feel the same again because the balance of power had shifted. And there was no going back. I could see it in their faces, the mix of shock and disbelief, and I smiled to myself, knowing that the real satisfaction wasn't in their apology or recognition. It was in the fact that I had done it entirely on my own terms. And they had no choice but to watch. The weight of years of dismissal and subtle cruelty felt lighter in that moment, replaced by a fierce clarity and confidence, the kind that only comes when you realize that success doesn't need validation from the people who refuse to see it. That sometimes the best revenge is simply living your life and letting them find out too late that they were wrong about you the entire time. I left the party that night knowing the next steps were going to be just as crucial, carefully measured, and quietly devastating in the best possible way, and I couldn't wait to see how they would react when the next part of my plan unfolded. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Mom's face had changed, the sudden tension that had settled in the room, and the way everyone had paused, unsure of what to do or say next. I knew that first moment had been powerful, but I also knew it was only the beginning, and if I wanted the full impact, I had to move carefully, deliberately, and without anyone realizing what I was doing. I spent the next few weeks keeping up appearances, answering family calls and messages politely, attending casual dinners, all while making sure my life continued on its own quiet trajectory, building toward the next step that no one would see coming. I wasn't reckless, and I wasn't impatient. I was calculating every interaction, every conversation, every small slip of attention that might tip them off. I had learned over the years that subtlety could be more devastating than confrontation, and that was exactly what I intended to use. My sister, of course, continued to live as if nothing had changed, boasting casually about the engagement, showing off details of the wedding planning, the invitations, the choices for dresses and flowers, and I listened to it all, smiling when necessary, offering polite congratulations, but inside, I was quietly making sure that every single move she made could be leveraged for the ultimate reveal. I began keeping notes, small reminders of everything she boasted about, everything my parents praised her for, and I started planning how to turn that overconfidence into their own undoing. I wanted the exposure to be precise, to hit at just the right moment when everyone's expectations were completely inverted, and I couldn't risk a single misstep. Mom, as usual, continued to ask subtle, pointed questions whenever we spoke on the phone, questions that were really tests to see if I had started any serious relationships or if I had been planning anything significant. And I learned to answer in ways that were vague enough to avoid suspicion, but revealing enough to maintain the tension. "So, have you met anyone special?" she asked one evening, and I smiled softly, saying only that life had been busy and fulfilling in other ways, careful not to let her guess that I had already orchestrated a personal milestone that she would never have expected. Every time she pressed, I held my ground, letting her assume that I was still behind, still unengaged, still invisible, and every assumption she made was another brick in the foundation of what I was quietly building. Work became another place to quietly assert control, not for anyone's approval, but because every achievement I could document and accomplish in secrecy was another advantage when the time came to reveal it. I met deadlines early, exceeded expectations, and quietly saved significant opportunities and announcements for moments when my family would have no way to preempt or minimize them. I didn't brag, I didn't flaunt. I simply moved forward in a way that no one at home could track, and that control became intoxicating. I realized I had spent years underestimating myself because of their favoritism and constant comparisons, and now, for the first time, I felt like I was in the driver's seat, orchestrating everything without interference or judgment. Then came the moments with friends and extended family, where casual mentions of upcoming events, engagements, or celebrations gave me insight into the timing of everything, and I began mapping out how to coordinate my next move. I knew it had to be during a family gathering, a moment when attention was divided, when pride and expectation were high, and the timing would maximize the shock and emotional impact. Every phone call I returned, every casual visit I attended, every text exchange I had was now an exercise in observation and calculation, making sure I was ready for the moment when I could reveal the next part of the plan. The tension built quietly over those weeks, and I found a strange satisfaction in the anticipation, in the way that being underestimated gave me space to prepare, to be precise, and to control the unfolding of events in a way that felt almost cinematic in its inevitability. I was careful not to reveal too much to anyone close to me, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while the plan moved steadily toward completion. There were small risks, moments when someone almost caught a clue, a phrase I said, a message sent in haste, but I handled them with calm reasoning, redirecting attention and ensuring that the delicate balance of secrecy remained intact. Every interaction with my family reinforced my understanding of their weaknesses, their assumptions, and their blind spots, and I stored those details in my mind, turning them into tools I would use later. I began to feel a quiet thrill knowing that they were completely unaware, that every boast my sister made, every subtle check from my mom, every casual comment from my dad would all come back in a way that no one could anticipate. And that final reveal would feel inevitable, yet completely devastating to their assumptions. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about balance, about finally showing them that the one they had ignored and underestimated had quietly created a world they would never see coming. The weeks passed, and with every passing day, my sense of anticipation grew. I knew exactly how I wanted the next encounter to unfold, the timing of the reveal, the reactions, and the silence that would follow. I allowed myself small, private moments of satisfaction imagining their shock, and I felt a growing confidence in my own abilities, a sense that no amount of favoritism, judgment, or dismissal could hold me back because I had already built the most important thing entirely for myself. By the time the next family gathering arrived, I was ready, calm, and entirely in control, and I knew that nothing could derail the moment I had carefully orchestrated because I had anticipated every possible reaction and prepared every contingency. The family dinner that month had been pitched as casual, nothing special, just an ordinary Sunday gathering, but I knew better, and I felt a quiet surge of anticipation the moment I stepped through the door, knowing that this would be the perfect environment to escalate the situation I had been carefully building over weeks. Mom was bustling around in her usual way, checking the seating arrangements, making sure that everyone had just the right place at the table, while Dad wandered through the living room, adjusting the TV volume and peeking at his phone. Completely unaware that this time, the dynamic of the evening had already shifted. My sister, naturally, was talking nonstop, filling the air with stories about her engagement, her plans, her excitement, assuming as always that she was at the center of everyone's attention and that her place as the favorite was secure. I took a deep breath and moved into the room with calm confidence, carefully observing everyone, mentally noting the angles, the expressions, the assumptions that I was about to dismantle one by one. I started by engaging casually with relatives who were unaware of the tension between Mom, my sister, and me, keeping the conversation light and friendly, but always subtly steering topics toward milestones, relationships, and accomplishments. I wanted to plant the idea in their minds that I had been active, achieving, and building a life quietly, away from the judgment and favoritism that I had always faced at home. I could feel my sister growing slightly uncomfortable as I shared anecdotes about work projects, personal goals, and experiences that no one at the table could argue with, and I smiled to myself, knowing that each subtle revelation was undermining her assumed superiority without creating any overt conflict. My parents, of course, noticed my composure, the way I had maintained a calm yet assertive presence in the room, and I could see the flickers of doubt crossing Mom's face, the subtle tension in Dad's posture, signals that they were finally processing that I had been quietly building a world that didn't require their validation. The meal progressed, and I noticed that every time my sister attempted to dominate a conversation or elicit praise, I had already prepared the perfect response, a way to redirect attention while still highlighting my own achievements. I wasn't rude, I wasn't confrontational, but I was strategic, and the effect was immediate and tangible, a shift in the room's energy that even the most oblivious guests could sense. My sister's confident smile began to falter slightly, her voice grew a fraction higher, and I could hear the subtle edge of frustration creeping into her words, though she tried to mask it behind laughter and exaggerated enthusiasm. I knew then that the first part of my plan had worked. I had disrupted the family hierarchy without anyone realizing it was intentional, and the seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of those who had always assumed my position as lesser. After dinner, when the coffee and dessert were served, I moved to the next stage, a small but deliberate act designed to make the upcoming revelation unavoidable and undeniable. I casually mentioned a social event I had attended the previous week, an engagement celebration that I had organized in secret, attended by friends and extended family who had been aware of my engagement before my immediate family. I described it lightly, almost dismissively, as if it were a minor detail, while watching the subtle reactions across the table. Mom's spoon trembled slightly in her hand, my sister's jaw tightened, and even Dad's eyes flicked up, catching the small signs that something significant was being revealed. I continued calmly, providing a few innocuous details without ever giving the full picture, letting curiosity build, letting the tension rise, knowing that once the final reveal came, the impact would be complete. My sister attempted to interrupt, to reclaim the narrative, but I maintained my composure, speaking steadily, naturally, almost conversationally, never raising my voice, letting the room hang on my words without giving her any opportunity to regain control. Every small pause, every subtle emphasis was deliberate, ensuring that the audience of family members remained engaged, processing the information and beginning to question their assumptions about who I was and what I had accomplished. I could feel a quiet power in the room, a shift that I had orchestrated entirely through patience, timing, and observation, and it thrilled me to know that this control had been built quietly, invisibly, without confrontation or argument, and that my family had no idea what was coming. By the end of the evening, the tension had grown to a point where it could no longer be ignored, and I knew that I had positioned everyone perfectly for the final revelation. I left the table with a sense of calm satisfaction, knowing that the foundation for the ultimate payoff was solid, the emotional leverage was in place, and the moment when I would finally reveal the full truth about my engagement would be irresistible, inevitable, and unforgettable. I had turned subtle observation into strategic action, patience into power, and invisibility into dominance. And the next encounter would be the one where my family could no longer assume anything about my life without reconsidering every assumption they had ever made. The weekend that followed the family dinner felt charged with anticipation, and I could sense that everyone was walking around on eggshells, unsure of exactly what was happening. While I quietly savored the knowledge that the next step was already set in motion and that the timing was perfect for maximum impact. I had spent the week carefully orchestrating interactions, subtly steering conversations and encounters toward subjects that would make my upcoming revelation feel natural yet completely unavoidable. And I could see that the tension was beginning to take hold as people became increasingly aware, without realizing why, that something significant was about to surface. Every phone call I returned, every text I sent, every casual mention of work, friends, or social gatherings was now a deliberate cue. A breadcrumb that would lead my family closer to understanding that I had quietly achieved something they had no idea existed, and the satisfaction I felt from this strategic control was exhilarating in a way that was almost tangible. When I arrived at my parents' house for what they assumed was just another ordinary lunch, I noticed immediately how the energy in the room had shifted, how Mom's casual cheerfulness carried an undercurrent of anxiety, how Dad's polite attentiveness seemed to mask confusion, and how my sister moved with a fraction more stiffness than usual, a clear sign that the previous week's disruptions had unsettled her more than she would admit. I greeted them calmly, allowed small talk to flow naturally, and observed the subtle cues that indicated my family was beginning to process the mounting inconsistencies in my narrative. And I knew that I had already taken control of the moment simply by remaining steady, composed, and attentive while letting them fill in the gaps themselves. I strategically delayed any direct revelation, carefully choosing the moments when their curiosity would peak and their defenses would be lowest, knowing that anticipation alone would make the eventual disclosure far more impactful. Over the course of the afternoon, I gently steered conversations toward engagements, weddings, and celebrations, casually asking questions about planning, preferences, and timelines, all while allowing my own story to remain just out of reach. A subtle shadow that grew larger with every exchange, leaving them increasingly unsettled. My sister attempted several times to dominate the conversation, to assert her importance, to remind everyone of the timeline she assumed was hers to control, but I responded with measured anecdotes, indirect references to events they had no knowledge of, and carefully constructed ambiguities that forced them to reconsider their assumptions about me without ever realizing they were being manipulated. Every observation I made, every question I asked, every carefully timed pause built toward the inevitable moment when the full revelation would land, and I could sense the growing tension in the room as my family struggled to reconcile what they thought they knew with the hints I was planting. The turning point came when I mentioned a recent social gathering that included friends, extended family, and a few colleagues, casually noting that I had already celebrated a major milestone in my life with the people closest to me. The kind of milestone they assumed I had yet to achieve, and I watched as the realization began to dawn in their expressions, small flickers of confusion and disbelief appearing almost simultaneously across their faces. Mom's hand lingered on her glass longer than usual, my sister's lips pressed together in an almost imperceptible line of frustration, and even Dad's gaze lingered on me with a new intensity, as if he were trying to piece together the puzzle of my quiet but deliberate absence from family milestones. I spoke slowly, naturally, almost conversationally, letting each phrase settle without adding unnecessary detail, knowing that leaving gaps for their imagination would only amplify the impact when the truth finally became undeniable. By the time dessert arrived, the tension had reached a critical point, and I could see that their minds were racing, trying to reconcile the carefully curated image of me as invisible, overlooked, or inconsequential with the subtle hints I had provided over the past several weeks. I allowed the smallest smile to cross my face, just enough to suggest calm confidence, and I realized that every word, every gesture, every interaction had led to this exact moment, positioning me as the one who held the power, the one who had quietly orchestrated the ultimate reversal of expectations. The room felt electric, charged with uncertainty, and I knew that the final act, the one that would make my engagement undeniable and unassailable, was imminent. And the satisfaction of knowing that the emotional payoff was about to be complete was nearly overwhelming as I prepared to deliver the revelation that would leave everyone stunned and utterly speechless. The moment I had been preparing for finally arrived, and I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing on every conversation, every glance, every subtle movement in the room as I positioned myself for the revelation that would irrevocably shift the balance of power in my family and redefine the assumptions they had all taken for granted for so long. I had spent weeks orchestrating this carefully, planting hints, letting curiosity grow, watching tension rise, and ensuring that every interaction had been strategically aligned so that when the time came to speak, there would be no room for denial or misinterpretation, and the impact would be complete, undeniable, and irreversible. The room was quiet, deceptively calm, with my parents and sister sitting just as they always had, but under the surface, I could sense the subtle ripples of uncertainty and confusion, the undercurrent of unease that I had cultivated meticulously. And I knew that everything I had done up to this point had been leading to this exact instance, a moment where timing, observation, and strategic patience would converge into an emotional crescendo that no one in the room could have anticipated. I began casually, almost conversationally, as if I were sharing a trivial update about my life, slipping small details about recent events, friends, and accomplishments into the conversation, deliberately choosing words and phrasing that would nudge their attention toward the truth without revealing it outright, allowing their curiosity to peak and their assumptions to fracture slowly, leaving them with the disorienting realization that the narrative they had long believed about my life was incomplete and flawed. Mom shifted in her seat, her smile faltering as subtle doubt crossed her expression. My sister's confident posture wavered imperceptibly as she attempted to maintain control of the conversation, and Dad leaned forward slightly. His attention suddenly focused on every word I spoke, as if he were unconsciously piecing together the fragments I had scattered in the weeks prior, building toward a picture he had not been prepared to see. I continued carefully, describing social gatherings, milestones, and interactions with friends and colleagues, intentionally omitting the final connection, the critical element that would bring the full revelation into focus, letting the suspense build, letting the emotional tension stretch, and ensuring that when the moment of disclosure finally arrived, it would land with maximum impact and absolute clarity. Then, without raising my voice, without breaking my calm demeanor, I delivered it, casually slipping the words into the conversation with the precision of timing and tone I had rehearsed in my mind countless times, as if it were a simple, natural statement, though the significance of it could not have been greater. I revealed that I had been married the previous month, quietly, intentionally, and in a way that had kept the celebration and the commitment private, known only to a select few, completely bypassing the family hierarchy that had long dictated who received recognition, attention, and approval, and I watched as the reactions unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. Mom's glass slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor, her face registering a mixture of shock, disbelief, and silent frustration. My sister froze mid-sentence. Her carefully constructed narrative of superiority and assumed centrality shattered in an instant, and even Dad's composed expression faltered, his mind racing to reconcile the reality of my achievement with the assumptions he had long held about my place in the family. I allowed the moment to linger, maintaining eye contact, offering no explanation beyond the simple statement, letting the room absorb the full weight of what I had revealed, and watching the subtle shifts in posture, expression, and tone that signaled that the impact was complete. Every detail, every carefully planted hint, every strategically orchestrated interaction from the previous weeks had led to this precise moment, creating a crescendo of tension and satisfaction that was both undeniable and exhilarating. And I felt the quiet thrill of victory, knowing that my family could no longer assume anything about my life without considering the evidence I had now laid bare. I did not gloat, I did not demand acknowledgement. I simply allowed the truth to exist in the room, undeniable and unassailable, leaving them to confront the reality of my autonomy, my intelligence, and my ability to control the narrative in a way that had long been denied to me. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the electricity of disbelief, reflection, and unspoken acknowledgement, as my parents and sister processed the revelation and the implications of the careful planning, patience, and strategic execution that had brought it to fruition, and I knew that I had achieved precisely what I had set out to do, to turn the tables completely, to demonstrate mastery over assumptions and expectations, and to claim the emotional victory that had long been denied to me without resorting to cruelty or confrontation. In that charged stillness, I felt the satisfaction of having orchestrated a brilliant reversal, one that validated my agency, intelligence, and foresight, and left the room forever altered, not through argument or insistence, but through deliberate, patient, and calculated revelation that ensured my triumph was complete, irreversible, and undeniably mine, leaving behind a legacy of respect, astonishment, and quiet admiration for the precision and brilliance of my plan.